You're listening to School Counseling Simplified, a podcast with easy-to-implement strategies for busy school counselors. Here's your host, Rachel Davis from Bright Futures Counseling.
Hi there. Thanks for listening to another episode of School Counseling Simplified. So it is our last January episode, and remember, we are going to talk about grief. So last week, I shared with you some strategies for leading a preventative class lesson on grief. And today I'm going to talk with you about dealing with grief counseling in small groups and individual settings. So let's go ahead and dive in with these strategies. I hope you found last week's helpful. Give me some feedback. I love to hear what you're doing at your school that's working for you. So in a small group, I think grief groups are great for helping students really open up and share about their experiences. I've worked with several students individually as well, but I find the group setting to be much more healing. That being said, some students do withhold when they're in the group setting, withhold their information and their feelings, and for them it may be better to do it individually. So it's up to you. You can kind of assess the student's situation and their willingness to open up in a group, but I find the group setting to be a very healing space for students, and it's a space where they can feel like their experience is normalized. So I want to talk to you about a 5-week group that you could do. So this is what I do when I deal with students with grief. So first, when you're getting your referrals together, you want to group them ideally by the most similar situation that you can. So for example, I've done a group before where almost every student had lost, every student had lost either a mom or a dad. So this was a very close family member. Now you can also do a group where maybe someone lost a relative they weren't as close with. So maybe like extended family. And then you can even have grief groups that focus on like incarceration or other types of separation, maybe even divorce. So these are all different experiences, but the person who's maybe had a mother die is going to have a very different experience than the person who's maybe dad is in jail. So I've done both. Ideally, you're grouping people together who have similar experiences. That way it's relatable. But if it's the case where everyone just kind of has a variety, but you still want to do a group, I've done that as well too, where we had some people who were experiencing death of a family member, some people it was incarceration, some people it was divorce. I've done a mix too. It's a little harder to facilitate, but it is possible and definitely still worthwhile. But if you can, look at those referrals and try to group students together who have the most similar experiences. Now, in the first week, I like to just keep it light and do introduction and establishing group norms. So this is where you'll do your group rules and your feelings check, and then you're just kind of getting to know each other. And you don't want these students to feel like their identity is their grief. So instead of being like, oh, what are you here for? Who do you know that passed away? You don't want it to be like that. Rather, you want them to get to know each other for who they are so they can share some hobbies, any kind of icebreakers that you would do, typically get to know you games. You want to start off with that, kind of keep it light. But you can, in that first session, have students share why they are there if they feel comfortable. Now, a lot of this is age dependent also. So with the little guys, they may not be ready yet. But for the older kids, they may be able to say, oh, I'm in this group because my dad passed away or my brother passed away, something like that. But you only want to do this if students feel ready. And keep in mind, some students in the group may feel ready and some may not, and that's okay. Just have students share when they're ready. You want to make that clear in session 1. You want to let them know it is a safe space for sharing and that everything is going to be kept confidential. So you want all students to agree to that on the group rules. Now, I also like to do a journal with grief. So after each group session, they would have a journaling opportunity. And then I even put on there like a check-in. As I mentioned in the last episode, you've likely already talked to students about how grief is like a roller coaster. So you can have them say on like a scale of 1 to 10 how they're feeling that day, a rating scale regarding their grief. And then you can look at it together at the end of the group or throughout the group and see like, oh, so last week you were feeling a 6, now you're a 2. Next week you may be a 9, and just discuss how that's totally normal. And it's just a good way that they can kind of check in with themselves and do a self-assessment. So that's week 1. You just want them to get comfortable. You want to build a rapport and you want them to feel like they can share and that it is a safe space in the group. Now then week 2, so this is where you want to focus on feelings. So in week 2, you want to do a deep dive into how different emotions are related to grief. So it doesn't have to be just sadness. So I like to use discussion cards. So you can have students draw a discussion card with a different emotion on it. So maybe they draw happy or they draw sad, and then they're supposed to say how that relates to their grief. So even if they drew happy, they may be like, what? I don't feel happy about it. But maybe they can try to find a happy memory to reflect on or something like that. You want to let them know that all feelings are okay. Or maybe even if it was a case of like a terminal illness, a relief might be in there, right? So we're normalizing all of the feelings by letting students talk this out. So this is a vulnerable exercise, but I like to do it in session 2 because all of the students can take turns drawing the cards and saying how they've experienced a different emotion in relation to their loss. And again, you want to wrap that session up with a journal. Now, week 3, I like to call this one the memories week. And this is where students can talk about memories that they're having about their loved one. So they can share a favorite memory, a funny memory, a sad memory, a happy memory. Again, I like to do different emotions. So even sharing a sad memory or a frustrating memory is helpful for the group to do. So I like to use a flip book for this one. So you can discuss as a group or use a discussion dice, and then they can make a flip book and they can draw pictures. So I like to do each tab has like happy, sad, scared, excited, angry, whatever, and they can do a memory related to that. So if they get excited, a memory may be their loved one time surprised them with a trip to Disney World. So they can draw a picture of that or share that with the group. So you can do this 2 ways. You can start with a discussion dice where they're talking about it and then finish up with a flip book, or you can have them process independently using the flip book, and then they can kind of present their flip books to the group. I kind of like doing it that way. So that's week 3. That would be focusing on memories. And then week 4 is a support system. So I did talk about this last week, something you could do with a whole group, like a whole class. But with a small group, it's super important for them to identify people in their support system. So these are people at home, school, and in the community. So home could be siblings, parents, extended family, a neighbor. School could be, you definitely want to let them know that you are available as the counselor, but also teachers, maybe friends, custodian, secretary, principal, anyone at school. And then community members would be maybe people at church or people at Boy Scouts, people in sports, a coach, any community member that they encounter. Also, that could be in their support system. Now, we did this, like I said in last week's episode, I talked about how to do this at the class lesson level, but with the small group, you have a little more time and it's a little more intensive. So go ahead and have them write out how these different people could help them or how they would ask for help from these different people. And you could even role play them asking for help because that's an important part. And finally, the last week, week 5, is goal setting. So you may think goal setting, that's super weird to do in a grief group, but it's actually just setting goals for their progress. So you want to let them know, remind them that it is like a roller coaster. And remember, each week they're checking in on their self-assessment on how they're feeling, the rating scales. But you do want to let them know that there is hope and progress and things will get better and that their life is not defined by this moment. So what you can do is have them set some goals. So you want them to set a goal for, next week, for next month, for next year. So this can be unrelated to their actual loss. So for example, they could say maybe someone is grieving the loss of a sibling, but their goal is that they're going to try out for a sport or something. It may seem kind of random, but the point is that they're not letting that event define their life, and they're still going to remain hopeful and look forward to the future. So that's a good thing to do, and have them identify their goals with each other. Now, 2 things that I like to do. It is a physical connecting experience. This is something I like to do at the end of the group, and I'll give you 2 examples that I've done in the past with students. But mainly everything I've said so far Now, this is if you're meeting in person, students are sitting all together at a little circle table or kidney table. And, we're doing a lot of writing and talking and dice and stuff. If you're doing this virtually, maybe you're all together on a Zoom call. But at the end, I like to do a physical connecting experience. This is something where we're like getting out of our seats and doing something a little differently and a little more tangible. So 2 things I've done. One is balloons. So students got to write a letter to their loved one, put it in a balloon, and we released them in the air. Now, I love the symbolization of this and the visual of letting go and knowing that your message is private. And it also kind of has that spiritual aspect if students choose to believe so, where it's kind of going, up to the sky. But this is before I was like all anti-plastic, and now I like cringe at the thought of putting balloons into the environment. So you could still do the balloons, but maybe not release them in the air. You can modify that as you wish, or you can do it as I said. But like I said, I did that in the past. I probably would not do it now, but I do love that visual of release and letting go. But the second one, and obviously you cannot do the balloons in a virtual setting, but the second example I'm going to tell you could do virtually or in person, and that is a show and tell. And I had students who really loved this. They were so proud of what they could bring. So show and tell is where a student can bring in a photo of their loved one, or maybe their loved one has given them something like a keepsake. I've had students bring in like jewelry, like a little necklace or something. Definitely photos, just anything they want, and it's almost a show and tell experience. Now, again, you could do this over Zoom or virtually, which is great. All students may not feel comfortable doing this, so don't push it. Everything with the grief group, this is the one small group I do where participation is not one of the rules, right? So we obviously want students to participate so they can heal, but we also want to be mindful of how intimidating and scary and sad this can be for them. So we want to give them grace through this process so they don't have to do it, but the students that I did it with really liked this exercise and really found it beneficial. So in review, if you're doing a group on grief, what I recommend is first look at your referrals and try to group students together in the most similar categories possible. But you could do a group that has a variety of kiddos, even like divorce, incarceration, death of an extended family member, death of a close family member, death of a pet, perhaps, if they had a really strong relationship. So you can do a mixed bag, or you can try to group them together based on their experience. The different weeks you're going to do here, each week will have a feelings check, and then I would like you to end with a journal, and I suggest doing a rating scale where students can self-assess how they're feeling, because we mentioned it's like a roller coaster. And I even like to do it where they draw dots and then connect the lines so they can physically see. It's a great visual of seeing the roller coaster, the ups and downs. So if they draw a dot at a 1 and then at a 5 and then back down to a 4, they can see the ups and downs. So I totally recommend doing that every week. In the first week, I recommend introducing each other and establishing group norms, so building rapport. This is establishing a fun, safe space and making students feel like they can share. And this keeps it very low key and just getting them comfortable week 1, not necessarily talking about why they're there unless they're choosing to. Week 2, you talk about feelings. I recommend doing discussion cards where they're grabbing those feelings words and talking about their experience. Week 3 is memories. So you can do that flip book, remember, where they're also talking about a memory through the lens of a different emotion. And week 4 is identifying people in their support system and how they would ask for help. And week 5 is goal setting, so planning for the future and staying hopeful. And then again, you can, in your last session, do a physical connecting experience, something tangible, such as the balloons or a show and tell exercise. So I hope you found that helpful. Please let me know what you're doing with your kiddos. I struggle with grief groups, to be honest. They're definitely not my favorite to do, but I want to support students and help them the best way I can. It's just, they can be so hard. So get in our Facebook group, Bright Future School Counselors. We're over on Facebook, and I would love to hear what you all are doing to help your students through grief. I'm sure you have some great ideas, and if we can share with each other, then we can best support our students in the best way possible. Hey y'all, so I'm jumping over. I have a mistake that I made. If you noticed, I said at the beginning of the episode that I was going to discuss strategies for grief counseling within small groups and individual sessions. But I just got on a tangent all about groups and completely forgot to talk about individual sessions. So now I am over here editing the podcast and I realized I completely left that part out. So I'm just going to add it in now. So bear with me, the audio quality will be a little different, but I definitely did not want to leave this part out because it is oh so important. So individual grief counseling is probably the most challenging of all 3 tiers. Those class preventative lessons are probably the least intimidating. The small groups, at least you have a group to bounce off of. But the individual one-on-one can be really tricky to navigate and challenging. So I want to give you a few pointers. The main thing is the less plan, the better. So just listen. Be a sounding board for these students just to vent and to let you know how they're feeling. And that's what I recommend if you're working with middle or high school. I worked with a high school student last year who had a brother pass away in a tragic way, and I would merely listen to her. And that was just something that I provided a safe space. She could come. We didn't even have a set session time. She would just stop by whenever she needed to talk. And that was the best way to work through it with her. Now, on the other hand, I've worked with younger students before where they're not really mature enough to deal with it this way. So you do want to have a little more structure. So for those younger students, you do want to use some activities. Some examples of things that I like to do is make cards. So have your students draw a card or write a letter to their lost loved one. They can draw a picture. This is all, developmental appropriate. So for the younger kids, they can just draw a picture. That, middle age, maybe do a card, so some pictures and some writing, and then the older they are, they could do a letter. So I've found the cards to be really powerful. The kids enjoy doing them, and it's kind of a fun creative outlet and a way that they can express how they're feeling and talk to their loved one and say anything that they want to say. Maybe they're saying they miss them. And of course, you want to do this at the student's comfort level. So if they feel uncomfortable or think that's weird, the idea of talking to their lost one, then you can definitely skip that. Now, the letters, I actually did this with the high school student I referred to earlier. She would just write on her phone or just type out the feelings, and then she would bring it in to me to read. And I would just simply read it back to her out loud and then see if she had anything else to share. We wouldn't, you're just here to be a sounding board, basically. You're not here to psychoanalyze them or anything. That's not your role. You're just here to provide them with as much support as possible so they can be successful during their school day. And the rating scales that I mentioned that I like to do with the group, so using that analogy, like grief is a roller coaster and having students check in on a scale of 1 to 10, I love to do that with an individual also, so you can keep track over time, seeing how their feelings change day to day. And one more activity I forgot to mention for those younger kiddos, so you can, or 2 more rather, you can write cards, write letters. You can use discussion cards. So oftentimes it's hard for them to just talk openly. But if you have some prompt cards or some discussion cards, that's a great way to get the conversation going. And then finally, a board game. So for example, I have a board game in my TPT store. That's one I use. It has some discussion cards. So they roll the die, and then based on the different spaces they land on, that corresponds to a discussion card that they could have. So a board game is basically discussion cards, just a little more fun way to play it. So just to wrap it up for those individual grief sessions, these are challenging, I know, but some things to keep in mind if you're going to deal with older students. Less is more with the plan. Maybe do a journal, allow them to do some letter writing independently, even digitally, and just kind of provide that space to listen. And then with the younger ones, you do want to do some activities to make them feel more comfortable opening up, such as making a card, drawing a picture, writing letters, using discussion cards, or using a board game to get a conversation going. So I hope you found this helpful. Sorry I had to tag this on the end, but I'm glad I realized that I forgot to talk about it because this Tier 3 intervention is super important. Okay, again, please connect with us in the Facebook group because I would love to hear what you're doing with your students in regards to grief counseling. And I hope you have a beautiful afternoon.
Thanks for listening to School Counseling Simplified. You can find the links from today's episode in the show notes. If you'd like to connect with Rachel, she's on Instagram and Teachers Pay Teachers at Bright Futures Counseling. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any episodes of School Counseling Simplified. Talk to you next week.